Imagine stepping into a British kitchen in the dead of winter, sometime between 1950 and 1970. The air is cold. Condensation clings to the inside of windows. And there's one goal: feed the whole family with whatever's left in the larder. No takeaways, no frozen meals, just ingenuity, thrift, and whatever was cheapest at the market. We're about to explore 25 humble yet unforgettable foods that working-class British families relied on to survive those brutal winters. These meals weren't chosen. They were endured, remembered, and passed down. Some were belly-warming marvels, others, well, survived on practicality alone. But each one has a story, a scent, and a place in the collective memory of a nation persevering through cold homes and colder realities. Ready to discover what kept Britain going, one spoonful at a time? But before we dive into the first dish, if you enjoy stories that dig beneath the surface of everyday life, uncover forgotten traditions, and bring the past back to life, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This journey through Britain's winter survival food is just one way we honor the resilience of ordinary people. So stick around and don't forget to click the bell so you won't miss what's coming next. Beef stew with root vegetables. Nothing says winter survival quite like a pot of beef stew bubbling for hours on a stove older than the marriage that made it. In thousands of working-class terrace houses, beef stew wasn't a choice. It was a constant. Housewives pinched coins for cheap cuts like shin or scrag end. Priced under 2 shillings per pound in 1952. They transformed these tough slices into tender morsels with time, patience, and whatever root vegetables were at hand. Carrots, Swedes, onions, and of course, mountains of potatoes, reportedly up to 4 pounds per person weekly in northern homes, according to the 1951 National Food Survey. Children dug through bowls to fish out soft potatoes soaked in meat broth. Dads, tired from factory shifts, wrapped calloused hands around steaming mugs. School versions of stew were often watery and bland, met with grimaces. But at home, done right, it brought something like peace. It didn't sparkle on a plate, but in a January kitchen where the damp never left, that savory smell was about as close to comfort as many families ever got. Dumplings, if beef stew was the standard. Dumplings were its redemption. Drop in a clump of flour and Suet, and watch it swell into a filling, bready triumph. Suet, only pennies per pound, turned broth into a proper dinner. Pan lids rattled as dumplings rose like pale blotches, heavy enough to hush hunger. By 1953, households were eating nearly half a pound of Suet weekly. That's how central these doughy saviors became, but they didn't win everyone over. Kids often eye-rolled at their dense centers. Mums insisted they stick to your ribs. Dads rarely complained. If it filled the belly, it served its purpose. In mining communities, dumplings were so substantial, they almost felt like a separate course. The sound of a spoon cracking one open, letting the steam escape, was reassurance that tonight, no one would go to bed hungry. Even for the fussier eaters, dumplings meant the stew had teeth. Lancashire hot pot step into a Lancashire kitchen, and the smell of hot pot could hit before the warmth did. Layers of potato, onions, carrots, and scraps of mutton nestled beneath a crisped crust. In mill towns where a man's wage fluctuated like the weather, hot pot was a thrifty masterpiece. Mutton, cheaper than beef in 1952, at just 1 shilling and 8 pence per pound, made this hearty dish the soul food of the North. Carefully stacked potatoes acted like thick blankets for the meal beneath, soaking up every trace of flavor during the long bake. Surveys in the 50s showed that northern households consumed up to 40% more potatoes than southerners, and you could taste it in hot pot's hard-won crust. But not everyone was a fan. Kids turned up noses at the fatty edges. Mums sighed at preparation that ate up most of the afternoon. Only dads were consistently satisfied, finding in their bowls both thrift and sustenance. In Lancashire, it wasn't merely a dish, it was proof of who you were. Bubble and squeak, this wasn't food. It was a sound, a smell, a Monday ritual. With meat leftovers long gone, bubble and squeak kept the family fed. Crispy mixtures of yesterday's cabbage and potatoes, fried together until golden, emerged in kitchens up and down the country. At 4 pence per pound, potatoes became the backbone of British winter cuisine. No surprise they appeared in nearly every budget ledger. The name came from the sizzle, the hiss and pop in shallow pans. Kids dragged forks sluggishly through limp cabbage, eyes pleading for something better. Fathers, however, prized the bits that browned at the edges. In wealthier homes, a spoonful of saved bacon fat elevated it. For others, it was just patience and a hot pan. Ministry of Food leaflets, dating from rationing years, instructed families to rely on it. Maybe it wasn't glamorous, but in cold, thin-walled houses, it echoed with the sound of survival. Toad in the hole may sound absurd, but it stood proudly on many winter tables. Yorkshire pudding batter padded stretched rations of sausage into meals for entire families. Just half a pound of sausages, costing around 1 shilling and 6 pence in 1960, could, once encased in that golden mix, feed 6 tired mouths. Housewives became architects of thrift, pouring batter around sizzling meat. The tin songs crackled with fat. The edges crisped beautifully. Corners were fought over. The meaty middle soaked up onion gravy while crusts stole the spotlight. In 1962, data showed Brits consumed over 1.12 pounds of sausage per person weekly, but not all were created equal. High street butchers promised spice and depth, while factory-made links often reduced to rubbery nubs. Still, toad in the hole worked. When meat was scarce and bellies empty, it brought warmth and the illusion, however brief, of abundance. Corned beef hash imported and affordable. Corned beef was a quiet hero of British winters. By the early 1950s, the UK brought in over 200,000 tons of the stuff annually, mostly from Argentina. At just 2 shillings and 4 pence per pound, it was cheaper than cuts from British butchers, and it could wait patiently in the back of a cupboard. Immune to broken fridges and interrupted paydays, mothers diced it with onions and potatoes, frying it until the aroma overpowered the tinny tang inside the meat. The 1953 National Food Survey said a staggering 65% of lower-income households used tinned corned beef weekly. Out of necessity, rarely choice. Kids wrinkled noses. Dads requested extra gravy. Mums quietly approved of its stubborn longevity. In some chip shops, they battered and fried it into fritters just to mask the taste. Yet that smell, onions and salt frying in fattiness, brings many right back to those narrow kitchens where every meal required hustle and hope. Pea soup with ham bone. Pot of pea soup was often the difference between something hot to eat and going without. Dried split peas were a lifeline, cheap, filling, and protein-rich. By the 1950s, the average household consumed nearly 12 ounces a week. Paired with a ham bone, actual meat optional, they simmered slowly into bowls of thick, steaming sustenance. Some loved it. Others dreaded every spoonful. The smell alone, heavy and earthy, lingered. In Britain's mining regions, meals like this weren't weekend choices. They were midweek standards. A 1953 survey reported that peas pudding with saveloys appeared on over half the Northeast's dinner tables twice weekly. Leaflets from the Ministry of Food pushed split peas as the wartime superfood. By the 60s, they'd become part of working-class DNA. Whether welcomed or not, pea-based soups offered warmth in households where warmth was in short supply, and reminded everyone that basic wasn't always boring. Sometimes it was all there was. Bread and dripping. Few dishes capture hardship like bread and dripping. This was the repurposed ghost of Sunday's roast. Collected fat, solidified and salty, spread on slices of cold bread. A single loaf cost just 11 pence in 1951, and families consumed over 4 loaves per person per week. That meant where there was bread, there was filler, and in leaner moments, even this became a lifesaver. To some, it was a treat. To others, a grim fallback. Kids remember the semi-translucent shimmer of fat beneath a knife, the crust crunching under pressure. Dads didn't argue. They needed the calories. Mums served it when cupboards echoed. It was less a dish and more a habit, taught by wartime rationing. Immortalized through Ministry of Food warnings that reminded families, nothing is to be wasted. In back-to-back terrace homes from Birmingham to Glasgow, bread and dripping wasn't a meal. It was a pause, something to get through until wages came. Rabbit stew in post-war Britain. Rabbit stew wasn't culinary curiosity. It was a matter of meat or no meat. After the war, industries were renewed, but wages lagged. So families turned to rabbits, snared in fields, gifted by neighbors, or sold cheap by the butcher for under a shilling each. If any of these dishes are stirring up memories or surprising you, drop a comment below. Did your nan make bubble and squeak just like this? Or is there something your family had that we haven't mentioned yet? We'd love to hear your stories, and while you're at it, give the video a like. It helps more people find these forgotten flavors of Britain's past. Rabbit stew in post-war Britain. Rabbit stew wasn't culinary curiosity. It was a matter of meat or no meat. After the war, industries were renewed, but wages lagged. So families turned to rabbits, snared in fields, gifted by neighbors, or sold cheap by the butcher for under £1 each. Into the pot they went, simmered with onions, carrots, and potatoes, spreading across 2 nights in many homes where every second dinner was a stretch. The meat was lean, sometimes stringy, but it carried a depth, its gamey tang masking how little was really there. In rural areas, it was just food, eaten without discussion. In town kitchens, though, kids eyed plates with caution, inspecting bones and flavor alike. Dads praised its rich broth, tired of watered-down mutton, while mums gave quiet thanks for portions that stretched. By 1952, rabbit accounted for up to 5% of meat intake in agricultural households, according to national food surveys. But its nickname, poor man's chicken, said it all. As prosperity crept in during the 60s, rabbit disappeared from tables with barely a goodbye, remembered more for what it stood for than how it tasted. Tripe and onions, if there was ever a test of thrift over appetite, it was tripe. This pale, honeycombed lining of a cow's stomach didn't comfort. It challenged. Yet at 4 pence per pound, it was impossible to ignore. In northern towns like Manchester, tripe shops, over 200 of them, kept families fed during the 1950s, part of a grimy economy that couldn't leave any part of the animal untouched. Tripe was boiled slowly with onions until the house took on a sharp, unmistakable smell that hit before the plate did. National surveys reveal that offal made up nearly 15% of meat intake in working households in 1952, and tripe led the charge. Dad swore by its strength-giving magic. Mums accepted its price point. But kids? They gagged or flat out refused. School canteens didn't help, serving rubbery versions that turned a generation off for life. And when families finally had the chance to move past austerity, they didn't hesitate. By the late 60s, tripe had fallen out of favor almost completely, with more than 70% decline in consumption. Today it lives only in memory, loved or loathed, but always tied to survival, not choice. Rice pudding? When the wind howled through windows and the oven still had heat, rice pudding made the most of it. This wasn't just a dessert. It was a slow promise. Imported rice cost only pennies per pound in the 1950s. And after milk rationing ended in 1954, more families embraced the comfort and utility of this creamy, slow-baked staple. Sugar and nutmeg swirled into slowly simmering milky rice, filling the kitchen with warm, sweet smells. Enamel dishes browned in corners as the top formed that chewy signature skin. By 1955, it was in the top 3 sweet dishes consumed weekly across working-class homes, according to national surveys. 70% had it on constant repeat. Kids squabbled over who got the good bits. Some adored that brown skin. Others retched at it. Dads dove into the soft middle, often with a dollop of jam for color. School dinner halls turned it into legend, serving tray-sized quantities so routinely that few in Britain didn't grow up with an opinion on rice pudding. It was cozy, it was constant, and whether loved or loathed, it meant winter evenings weren't entirely bleak. Bread and butter pudding, where some saw waste, working-class mums saw dessert. Bread and butter pudding took stale leftovers and spun them into something almost celebratory. Thick-cut slices of bread were layered with dried fruits, slathered in custard and baked until golden, fragrant, rich, and sweet enough to pass for a treat. Bread was among the cheapest items available, just 11 pence for a large loaf in 1951, and with households consuming over 4 per person weekly, stale slices were inevitable. Rationing had taught harsh lessons, and Ministry of Food pamphlets from the 1940s and 50s made clear, not a crumb should be wasted. Currants puffed up inside custard-soaked layers, sugar crisped along the edges. Kids recall the scent more than the taste. Dads ate it gladly. Mums took quiet pride in turning yesterday's scraps into something that felt indulgent. Not everything worked. School versions were often criticized as soggy or overly sweet. But home-baked puddings left a lasting impression. In frugal kitchens, This dish proved luxury didn't come from what you bought, but from what you refused to throw away. Apple crumble was born in a time of rationing, but somehow became an indispensable dessert even after peace returned. Apples, stewed with sugar, sat beneath a rough and ready topping of flour, margarine, and oats, a rustic alternative to the short crust pies Britain could no longer afford. It emerged in the wartime 1940s out of need, but by the 50s, it had taken permanent residence on winter tables. The scent of cooking apples wafted through homes already filled with the earthy tang of coal smoke. Golden crusts cracked under spoons, revealing bubbling fruit underneath. Ministry of Food leaflets from 1941 onward promoted crumbles as fat-saving substitutes for pies, and households built habits around them. In 1960, national stats showed fruit puddings being baked weekly in 80% of homes, with apple leading the pack. Crumbles weren't without debate. Some insisted on a crisp topping, others preferred barely browned softness. School versions drowned in custard became a memory marker for many, but at home, a properly made apple crumble felt like reward, proof that austerity could sometimes take delicious form. Jam roly-poly dense, sticky, and unapologetically heavy, jam roly-poly staked its reputation on doing one thing well, filling you up. Rolled suet dough slathered with jam and steamed or baked, it was one of Britain's most iconic school dinner desserts during the 1950s and 60s. And despite the jokes, it wasn't just a whole food cliché. It was kitchen strategy. Housewives worked Suet, flour, and water into a thick dough, rolled tightly around sticky jam, then steamed for what felt like an age. Suet consumption in 1954 peaked at nearly half a pound per household weekly. Much of it headed into puddings just like this. Kids remember the portions, often overly generous, swimming in custard, sweet and sticky, or hopelessly claggy. Dads praised the bulk, especially in houses low on meat. Mums loved it because it never failed to satisfy. The Ministry of Food had once heralded roly-poly desserts during the war as a calorie-rich way to keep meatless diets going. But by the 1980s, few homes still made it. It left with rationing habits. A warm, filling, slightly overwhelming goodbye. Treacle sponge pudding. This was the pudding that hinted at luxury without ever requiring it. A pale sponge steamed in a tin, dripping with golden syrup as it emerged. Rich in appearance and rich in taste, but made from basics like flour, eggs, and Tate & Lyle's iconic syrup tins, which cost less than a shilling in the 1960s. In a world where chocolate desserts were rare and cream was reserved for Christmas, treacle sponge gave midweek meals something special. Housewives relied on it during dark months when morale, just like sugar, needed stretching. Syrup sales by 1965 were found in over 70% of homes according to national reports. And sponge puddings like this were a key reason. Children scraped bowls clean. Fathers cherished the depth it offered after dinner. Mums knew it would never fail. That heavy, sticky sweet smell filled kitchens, stuck to wallpaper, and made you feel, if only for an hour, that things were okay. Still, it wasn't grand. It was quiet comfort dressed as decadence, measured in spoonfuls, not extravagance. Spotted Dick. This dessert might have had kids giggling at the name, but no one laughed when they saw it on their plate. Spotted Dick was suet-based and loaded with dried fruit, then steamed and served beneath ladles of warm custard. It was dense, chewy, and divisive, but you couldn't ignore it. Currants or raisins spotted the pale dough, giving it both nutrition and name. Suet powered it with calories to withstand the coldest evenings. Throughout the 50s and 60s, school canteens dished it out weekly, sometimes thick, sometimes rubbery. Dried fruit imports soared post-war, with 1956 records showing households purchasing an average of 12 ounces monthly, much of it bound for puddings like this. Children debated its texture. Fathers asked for seconds. Mothers knew it got the job done, but it wasn't about delight. Spotted Dick belonged to an era where desserts weren't just sweet, they were survival tools. Its presence meant a hot end to a hard day. And even if hearts weren't always warmed, stomachs certainly were. Golden syrup pudding. There may not have been much gold in working-class Britain during the 1960s, but there was golden syrup. Treacle-tinted and sticky sweet. This syrupy sponge pudding gleamed on the plate, an echo of indulgence bought not with money but with flour, eggs, and a humble tin pulled from the back cupboard. Tate & Lyle's green and gold can became an icon on shelves, a reliable way to brighten even the grayest Tuesday. Syrup cost under $1 in the 60s, yet it stretched into dozens of puddings. National food surveys from 1965 show syrup as one of the 5 most purchased sweeteners in Britain, used weekly in over 70% of households. Housewives knew what it meant, a guaranteed win. Children licked bowls clean, watching syrup stretch and drip. Fathers called it proper comfort, after days ruled by frostbite and factory shifts. Mums trusted it entirely. No matter how meager the pantry, syrup pudding came through. It wasn't elaborate, but when its heavy steam filled cramped kitchens, it masked the cold in the corners and replaced it, just for a moment, with something like warmth. Treacle tart was less dessert, more sleight of hand. Housewives took stale breadcrumbs, golden syrup, and a splash of lemon, then tucked it all into a short crust pastry to produce something that looked far more impressive than it cost. For families watching every penny, it was a miracle of disguise, decadence drawn from scraps. Bread never went to waste. At 11 pence per large loaf, it was the backbone of the British diet. Golden syrup did the heavy lifting. In the 1950s and 60s, Tate & Lyle marketed syrup relentlessly, embedding it into British baking habits, with treacle tart leading the way. By 1962, syrup use had climbed by 20% annually, and this dish drove much of that demand. Kids remember the sticky crumb clinging to their teeth. Fathers carved thick wedges beside cups of tea. Mothers marveled at how something made of yesterday's crumbs could look like a Sunday treat. For some, it was sickly sweet. For others, the perfect end to a thrifty meal. Treacle tart didn't pretend to be fancy, it just put on a good show. A quiet reminder that resourcefulness could wear the mask of luxury, even if nobody was fooled. Suet crust pies weren't designed for delight, they were built to fill. Thick, starchy pastry made from cheap suet, wrapped around leftovers, becoming fortresses of calories during months when warmth and waistlines both needed padding. Just a few pence per pound made Suet the go-to for housewives trying to bulk up dinners on the slimmest of budgets. Anything could go inside. Meat scraps, vegetables, beans, gravy-soaked odds and ends. Once sealed in Suet and steamed, it became a heavyweight of the dinner table. Wartime Ministry of Food booklets had pushed the recipe heavily, and it lingered into the 1950s when memories of rationing still lingered in every corner of the kitchen. In northern towns, with their obsession for food, proper and filling, Suet pies became part of the culture. By 1955, statistics show half a pound of Suet was consumed per household each week, much of it destined for these pies. Kids chewed through thick walls of pastry to find scant fillings. Dads praised them as food made for hard workers. Mums leaned on them, not because they loved them, but because they worked. It wasn't comfort food. It was survival, disguised as dinner. Figgy Duff. Many of these desserts, like Figgy Duff, didn't last long in modern kitchens. They faded alongside manual labor, coal ranges, and paper-wrapped groceries. But for a while, these were the markers of celebration and survival. Dense with raisins, Suet, sugar, and spices, steamed into submission and served around Christmas time. Loved by some, tolerated by others, they spoke volumes about a time when indulgence wasn't at odds with hardship. In fact, one often relied on the other. If these stories made you smile, wince, or remember your own kitchen growing up, why not share it in the comments? Let's build a space where these memories live on, one dish at a time. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to join us on more journeys through history, culture, and food that shaped lives. Because some flavors may fade, but their stories don't have to.